When it comes to Congo and Eastern DRC, looking at these reports that started targeting M23 that we had very little information about, other than the history of how it came to exist. I was struck by the fact that none of my fellow researcher or colleagues in institutions where I was, in this case in the United States, but also in France and Europe, I was surprised that nobody was actually going on the ground and reporting from the inside. So we had this one-sided narrative or one-sided reporting on M23, and M23, every time they did issue any type of statement, it was always dismissed by everybody. So for me, I could not have enough elements to be able to assess what was going on the ground. And also because I did, when you're a language analyst and you spend your 20 years reading and analyzing text and words in context, and when you teach those topics, it's very easy for you to see when a text manipulates. So that can be through the format. For example, an author who is a scholar who writes an opinion piece is going to have a little more freedom to express their opinion. And they could also use some terminology that can show a level of subjectivity. And that level of subjectivity can be manipulative. And that's exactly what I noticed with certain scholars that are considered as the biggest experts on the region, who had even a large monopoly of information because they have built research centers and data sets that report on violence. I was struck by the fact that they were never really explaining why these crimes were happening. It was more as an observation, always in a kind of balanced perspective of A says this and B says that, with no, I wouldn't say lack of analysis, but in a way it is a lack of analysis, but in any case a lack of perspective or posture. And this is something that I noticed. And it was one-sided, of course. It was always anti-Rwanda, pro-Kinshasa, and I was not convinced by the elements that were provided, especially given what was unfolding at that specific time. To give you an example, Kinshasa says that M23, and those scholars I'm referring to say that M23 restarted or re-emerged in November 2021, and that they, took arms and just started the war. When we delve into documents and archives, and when we interview some of the M23 soldiers who were there at that time, they tell us that they were at that time in dialogue with Kinshasa. So they spent 14 months in Kinshasa, and I've checked the archives. There are many documents that prove that. And they were supposed to reach some form of agreement, peace agreement, or at least looking at the political grievances that M23 had at the time, still has. And what we see from what happened is that it is M23 that got attacked by the Congolese army in November 2021. And it's only in March 2022 that M23 decided to retaliate. So you see how in the collective memory it is accepted by everybody that M23 restarted the war, resurged. We use this terminology that in fact deprives us of the ability to understand what was happening. You see, now we're in a process of dialogue or peace agreement, but we were there back in 2021. So if we're discussing peace, maybe we could have avoided this entire war. Another thing that I saw, and to now explain why I went on the ground, is I really needed to understand, and I needed to have these elements that were lacking. We know that back in 2022, there were around 200 armed groups, according to Kinshasa or to the DRC government own assessment. And we would call this conflict or this crisis the M23 war. So again, as a language analyst, when I see the M23 war, I understand that the entire crisis is M23's responsibility. And so once I started looking into, at the time, the Nairobi peace process, understanding that M23 was the only armed group that was excluded from the Nairobi peace process when there was a number of other armed groups that were included, it was already a red flag. I was trying to understand what was going on, especially as M23 was the only armed group that had political grievances and stated them openly. So the question of why were they excluded, this is also the time when Kinshasa said that M23 is a terrorist group. Again, when we look at language analysis or terminology, terrorism has a specific definition. ADF, for example, that does launch terrorist attacks against civilians, killing arbitrarily people, civilians. We can call this a terrorist attack or terrorist acts, but there was no such evidence for M23. So this is where I kind of switched a little bit from, not shifted so much, but I started doing more of a journalistic work, so more investigative journalism than research, because I had to go on the ground, collect quick evidence. Academics, it takes us 6 months to a year to really do scholarly work or to produce scholarly work, because it has this particular format. When it comes to journalism, it can be more immediate. I also thought there was a real need, given what was going on, to have more information. And this is how I ended up originally first traveling there last year to speak with the spokesperson of the movement. I interviewed him more generally about what is M23, to have more insight about what the movement was. And then it prompted me to go further into the country to meet with exiled or refugees that had to go to Rwanda many times, but also those who were internally displaced. So kind of to have more, or to have backed evidence to what I was hearing from M23. And then I ultimately also interviewed the president of the movement with questions that were overall about what their grievances were at the time, which was this past December, so January, around the time that Goma was taken over. And also current news that were promoted or that were reported on, particularly the midterm group of experts report of December, this past December, that was saying that M23 was collaborating with ADF. So those are some of the questions that I asked Bertrand Bisimwa. And then also at the time we were discussing this Luanda peace process, and also the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Therese Kaikwamba Wagner, she was also saying that they will not accept any type of dialogue or discussion with M23. So I was also asking the president those questions. And finally, I did get to speak to a lot of people from Masisi, Ruchuru area, and it really gave me a broad perspective of what has been going on for 30 years, including before the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, because we already had this ideology that was operating in the region.